Fog still clung to the Garonne when Marie Delacour crossed Pont-de-Pierre, coat snapping in the winter wind and mind bristling with indignation. She would rather have been anywhere but on her way to Château Cellar. Yet the summons from Count Lucien de Montferrand had been clear: report at 9:30 sharp, portfolio in hand, palette in prime condition, and prepared to collaborate with Jacques Renard. Jacques, the peacock of the Bordeaux tasting circuit, winner of last year's Concours des Sommeliers by half a point, her half point. Robbed in the final blind, she could still hear the applause that had swelled around him like a searchlight while she stood smiling through clenched teeth, silver medal heavy on her neck. Now the Count had decreed they would co-curate some dusty stash of cellar bottles discovered beneath his ancestral estate. There were at least a dozen other sommeliers he might have paired her with. Of course, fate had chosen Jacques. A driver met her at the wrought iron gate and ferried her up the lime-lined allée to the chateau. Marie noted the building's pale stone, Baroque pediment, and tidy parterre gardens bleached by frost. On the terrace, a tall figure leaned against a balustrade, coat collar turned up, auburn hair catching the light like old copper. Even at a distance, she recognized Jacques' silhouette, relaxed, annoyingly confident, one hand around a porcelain cup, no doubt perfumed with single-origin espresso. "Marie," he said, straightening as she stepped from the car. His smile suggested cordiality, but his eyes assessed her, the way he judged a decanter, tilting slightly, searching for flaws in clarity. "Jacques," she touched the rim of her beret instead of offering a handshake. "I understand we are to be partners." "A term of art, I hope," he replied. Competitive cooperation might be nearer the mark. Before she could counter, the front doors swung wide and Count Lucien emerged, silver-bearded, eyes bright with the fever of discovery. "Mes amis, time is precious. The royal cellar awaits." "Royal?" Marie blinked, but the Count pressed on, ushering them through echoing corridors hung with oil portraits. Servants bore crates, lanterns, and clipboards. At the base of a spiral stair, an oak door gaped like a mouth sliced from the stone. Cold air, smelling of wet earth and forgotten harvests, exhaled up the steps. "Sealed since the Revolution," the Count announced. "My great-great-grandmother bricked it over in terror after mobs stormed the city. 2 days ago, masons, repairing a foundation crack, heard bottles clinking behind the wall." He produced a brass key and handed it to Marie. "I want the two of you to catalog every bottle, verify provenance, and design a tasting program for a royal gala next month. Auction estimates already flirt with the absurd, but first we must know what we have." Jacques whistled low. "Cellar once intended for Louis X, or perhaps Louis X, the Count said. Ledger fragments suggest shipments from 1750 through 1788. Unblended barrel samples and demijohns. Experimental cuvées, no one is certain. That is why I need the finest tongues in Bordeaux, 2 of them. Distinct yet complementary. Leave egos upstairs. S'il vous plaît." Marie tightened her scarf, swallowing a retort, and descended. The staircase delivered them to a limestone nave ribbed with brick arches. Spider webs laced wrought iron racks, stacked 3 levels high. Candles hissed. Dust lay like sifted flour, undisturbed for centuries except where the masons had broken through. She lifted a bottle. A cobalt seal, fleur-de-lis wax, no label. The punt was deeper than any modern mold. Her pulse quickened. Whatever else, the treasure was real. Jacques had already set up a collapsible table, notebook open, fountain pen uncapped. "Shall we establish categories?" he asked. "Color of glass, condition of cork, engraving on seal." "Age first," she cut in. Handwritten chalk marks under the dust could indicate vintage. "We brush, we photograph, we note ullage. Later we tackle flavor." "Very well, Captain," he said with mock salute. She ignored the tease and reached for a horsehair brush. Hours passed. They worked mostly in silence, trading bottles like chess players sliding pieces across the board. Each discovered marvel tugged them into fragile truce. An Iquem 1787 whose top still bore the intact imprint of the royal household. An experimental Malbec claret from a forgotten plot near Cahors, ghostly claret presumably destined for Marie Antoinette's sweet tooth. At dusk they emerged, dusty, exhilarated, and bone-tired. The Count served pheasant consommé by the library fire while they delivered a breathless report. A journalist would have swooned. The Count only nodded, eyes sharpening on each detail. "Tomorrow," he said, "I ask you to begin tasting. Carefully. Loss of even a teaspoon subtracts thousands of euros. But we must know which wines sing and which have succumbed to time." That night Marie stayed in a turret guest room overlooking vineyards silvered by moon. Unable to sleep, she paced, replaying every exchange with Jacques. She had expected oily charm or thinly veiled contempt. Instead, she found professionalism, even deference at moments. When she'd coaxed a stubborn bottle free, he had steadied the rack without comment. When he mistook a date smudged by mold, she corrected him gently, and he'd thanked her. Was rivalry a habit they both wore because Bordeaux loved the spectacle? She pressed her palm to the cold glass pane. Below, lantern glow bobbed near the vat house. Jacques taking his insomnia for a walk as well, perhaps. She turned away before he could look up. The second day their real trial began. The Count had allotted them a small stone chamber off the main cellar. 2 leather armchairs, radle crystal, silver spit buckets, and a ledger from 1769 containing cryptic entries signed simply J.B. Marie skimmed pages until one phrase snagged her imagination. Assemblage de coeur. Heart blend. No grape varieties listed, just a swirl of adjectives. Rouget de velours, soufflé de cassis, soupçon de violette, and a margin note. Destiné à l'oreille de la reine. Destined for the queen's ear? Surely an idiom meaning palate. She showed Jacques. A secret cuvée, possibly never bottled commercially, or poured only at Versailles, he murmured. Imagine restoring it. Marie's throat warmed at the We'd need compatible components, the ledger cross-references to barrel samples in green-necked bottles. Many are here. They began opening candidates with surgical care, extracting corks by twin-prong asso. Each wine they decanted into crystal beakers, inhaling aromas as fragile as moth wings. Some bottles were ruined, vinegar or dust. Others survived miraculously, still pulsing with life. The 1771 Cabernet Franc burst of dried rose petal, black tea, and saddle leather made them lock eyes in simultaneous wonder. A Merlot 1775, grown when Washington still commanded troops across the sea, shimmered with antique silk, yet lacked mid-palate vigor. They trial-blended micropores 5 milliliters at a time, keeping meticulous ratios. Each attempt came closer to what the ledger described. Velvet red, whisper of violet, breath of black currant. Between sips they sparred, though the edges dulled. Marie argued for a higher proportion of Cabernet Franc to lift aromatics. Jacques countered with a thread of Malbec for base notes of plum and spice. She accused him of chasing brawn at the expense of elegance. He teased her worship of ethereal bouquets. Their banter sparked, fizzed, then settled into laughter as a third blend hit the glass with jaw-dropping harmony. She leaned back, stunned. "Taste this." He did, closed his eyes, and exhaled one word. Cour. They were still calibrating when the Count poked his head through the doorway. "I expected paperwork, not rapture," Jacques gestured to the tiny beaker. "Sire, we may have resurrected a legend." The Count sniffed, sipped, and sat down without speaking. Tears welled behind his spectacles. "My ancestors would applaud. Proceed." Day slid into night again. They cleaned glassware, sealed remaining samples with inert gas, and climbed to the dining room for a late supper. Candles smoked. A single bottle of current vintage Saint-Emilion waited, unassuming, after everything they had tasted from centuries past. They poured anyway. Their palates, fatigued yet alive, caught modern notes too. Cell phone brightness, espresso hustle, city siren. They smiled across the table. You know, Jacques said, rolling the wine, I expected you to be harsher. Marie laughed. I expected you to call me names in the first hour. I considered Tannen tyrant, seemed unwise in a stone cellar without witnesses. She lifted her glass. To unwise restraint, they clinked. Somewhere between second pour and lemon tart, conversation veered from professional to personal. Marie spoke of her mother, who still ran a tiny wine bar in Libourne and texted daily weather reports like prayer flags. Jacques shared that he'd grown up in Paris's 11th arrondissement, over a bistro his grandparents owned. Summer visits to Médoc had been his escape from city grit. They laughed over mispronounced Burgundian villages in their novice years, confessed early palate mistakes, his certainty that eucalyptus in old Shiraz meant it was corked, her conviction that any Riesling under 7 grams of residual sugar was broken. The candlesticks burned low. Silence arrived, not awkward, but thick with something unnamed. When he reached forward to straighten a crumb on the linen near her hand, his knuckles brushed her fingers. A blush flared across her cheeks. She withdrew, not in repulsion, but in alarm at how pleasant the contact felt. She excused herself, heart drumming, and walked the corridors until chill air cooled her pulse. Rivalry was clean. It had edges, this gentler sensation, no mots. At breakfast they were careful, polite smiles, talk of pH readings and auction catalog fonts. Yet in the cellar, as soon as they resumed blending, ease returned like a cork popping. Fingers brushed again, this time neither retreated. They perfected assemblage de couleur after 42 iterations. The final ratio, 45% Cabernet Franc, 71-35%, Merlot, 75%. 15% Malbec, 73, 5% dash of pre-phylloxera Petit Verdot, found in a filigreed bottle so delicate they'd feared touching it. The wine possessed seraphic lift, truffle depth, and a glide on the tongue that made language redundant. They sealed 10 half bottles for the gala, inert gas blanketing the rest. With the centerpiece settled, they catalogued remaining troves. Among them, a Sauterne 1790 still glinting topaz, a sparkling Chenin from 1786, whose cork disintegrated but whose mousse reawakened pricked tears from Marie's eyes, claret composites, Armagnac casks, each marvel a duet of history and chemistry. The Count's staff inventoried under their supervision, but tasting decisions remained theirs alone. Jacques deferred when acidity sat in her sweet spot. She yielded when tannins prowled his domain. They moved like two hands olfacting the same invisible sculpture, finishing each other's descriptors. Marzipan, gunflint, quince paste, violin rosin, rain on slate. On the 7th night, after the team retired, they lingered in the salon, fire low, flakes of ash curved upward in thermal spirals. Jacques poured a tot of the 1790 Sauterne into sherry glasses. We could sell this drop for a semester's tuition at Sciences Po, he said. Squander it on ourselves, she teased. He raised a brow. Consider it hazard pay for risking lead poisoning from those ancient capsules. They sipped. Honeyed apricot, saffron threads, a crisp tail like orange blossom, liquid gold. You remember the Fado bar in Lisbon after the 2018 symposium? He asked quietly. She blinked. Of course. You and I argued about oxidative aging until half the city closed. You ordered a 1940 Madeira, insisted the caramel note masked volatile acidity. I said it was glory in a glass. You were right. He looked into the fire. I never admitted it. She smiled. You just did. Candles guttered, words hovered unsaid, swirling like sediment. Finally, she spoke. What happens after this project? Do we rewind the rivalry and resume throwing elbows at competitions? He set down his glass. I'd rather we rewrote the narrative. Her breath hitched. Into what genre? Collaborative. He paused. Possibly romantic, if the co author consents. The hearth ticked as logs settled. She traced the stem of her glass, thinking of the blend they'd borne, how opposing tannins and acids had fused into something finer. Chemistry was chemistry. I think, she said slowly, our palates are proof of concept. He leaned forward, eyes flicking to her mouth, but waited. She crossed the space first, tasting sauterne and possibility on his lips. When she pulled away, they both laughed, soft, astonished. Notes of affection, he murmured, no rivalry can suppress. Finish your wine, she said, cheeks glowing. Tomorrow we plan a gala. The weeks before the event flashed past like Remy Martin, swirling in snifters. Parisian couturiers delivered gowns and tuxedos. Sotheby's sent agents to document provenance. Journalists camped at the gates sniffing scandal, hoping the Count's stash might ignite debates about royal restitution. But the Count, savvy as any négociant, framed the narrative as heritage preserved for all France. Proceeds would fund vineyard sustainability and scholarships at the Oenology Institute. Under frescoed ceilings, Marie and Jacques rehearsed their presentation. She would open with the historical journey. He would guide the sensory arc. Together, they had chosen 8 wines for the seated tasting, culminating in assemblage de cour. They monitored cellar temperature, humidity, decant times to the minute. Every bottle wore a cradle of velvet and a microchip tracker. The night arrived. Limousines lined the courtyard. Diamonds glittered beneath chandeliers. Whispers about pre-revolution vintages rippled like silk. The Count welcomed dignitaries, vintners, and a smattering of foreign royalty, distant cousins of the regime that once guillotined his forebears. Backstage, Marie's nerves throbbed. Jacques touched her elbow. Remember the first swirl, he said. One breath, one note, then the music plays itself. She exhaled, nodded. They stepped onto the small dais. Cameras flashed. Her voice, steady, carried the room through centuries of viticulture, of kings who once sipped from crystal the color of twilight. Jacques followed, leading them through tasting. The citrus ghosts in an extinct varietal of Sauvignon, the tobacco lace in a Cabernet aged since Mozart penned his last measures. Finally came assemblage de concours. Silence deepened as they poured. Each guest raised a glass. Aromas drifted: violet, cassis, sandalwood, something like candle smoke in an old chapel. Jacques held his own glass, but spoke first. Wine survives because it changes. Grapes borrow rain, sun, soil, and, for a time, our hands. Then they remind us nothing valuable is truly possessed, only shared. He glanced at Marie. Tonight, we share a royal wine that never bowed to a crown, only to collaboration. Their eyes locked. She continued. Cabernet, Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot varietals, once rivals in the vineyard, found harmony in this blend. Jacques and I were rivals too. We believed distinction required distance. The cellar taught us otherwise. They raised their glasses together. A rustle of inhalation swept the hall. Then, as one, the audience tasted. A sigh, collective, reverent, and filled the ballroom. Applause followed, muted at first, then swelling into a roar that made chandeliers tremble. Reporters scribbled furiously. Patrons dabbed eyes. The value of the bottles tripled, quintupled, became irrelevant. After the toast, while bids skyrocketed in an adjacent salon, Maria escaped to a balcony overlooking moonlit vines. Air smelled of wet stone and orange tree blossoms from the orangery below. Footsteps approached. She didn't turn. Successful evening, Jacques said. If we measure by decibels, certainly. She smiled at the darkness. And by other metrics? He joined her at the balustrade. My fiercest rival just became the person I admire most. That feels like success. Moonlight carved silver lines down rows of dormant vines. She thought about seasons, pruning, waiting through winter for buds to break. Love perhaps required dormancy too, the hush of rivalry cooling into fertile loam. I'm launching a tasting room in St. Emilion next spring, she said. Small, precise, open to experimental pairings, it needs a wine director. He tilted his head. Any candidates? Only one, but he's rather opinionated. Qualifications include being mad about the proprietor. Essential. He took her hand. Consider the position filled. Laughter bubbled out of her, bright, wild, effervescent. He pulled her close. They kissed again, this time unhurried, tasting neither past nor future but the present, ripe, uncertain, marvelous. Below, in the gala hall, bids hammered, fortunes changed hands, stories etched themselves into ledgers. Above, two sommeliers wrote a quieter entry, a blend of pride and humility, spice and silk, rivalry and affection balanced on the fine edge of a glass. Days later, long after guests departed and cameras dimmed, the Count found them in the cellar, labeling the remaining bottles of assemblage de couture for archival storage. He watched them work, shoulders brushing, laughter echoing off walls once silent for centuries, and smiled. History, he said, is best served decanted. Marie looked up, her hand in Jacques' steady. And love? She asked. The Count chuckled. Love, my dear, is best served blended.